Hello everyone, this is Sam Spade with the next tutorial, connecting a keyboard to the buttons. Once again, I want to stress that this is a good place to talk and think about how you would design it yourself. Don't necessarily take my solution as the best solution. Think about whether or not it would work for you. One other thing I want to note is that in this instance, all of the code is actually identical between 2.25 and 2.3. So I'm only going to do it once in 2.3. To recap from the last tutorial, what we have is our button graph, and this button graph allows us to traverse buttons in the graph, but those things are not connected to any of our actual buttons. Now we want to connect it. The first step will be to add a variable to the button parent so that we can refer to those buttons by name. To do this, we go under the variables definition, we click add, we're going to call the variable my name, we're going to set it to be a type of string, and give it the default value default. One thing I want to point out is that another way to do this would be to have a separate parent underneath button parent just for buttons that you want to have this variable. If not, all of your buttons were going to be usable with a keyboard. However, for the purpose of this tutorial, we're just going to put this variable in the button parent. The next thing that we're going to do is come back over to the room and rearrange the buttons a little bit, just so that our button graph will be more interesting. And then we're going to get rid of the slider. You can use this same method to hook up the slider, but due to how the slider works, which is having to hold it down, you'd actually have to do a number of additional steps, which we're not going to cover in this tutorial. However, our tap and toggle buttons all work just fine with this method without anything additional, so we're going to use them. Now that we've rearranged these buttons, we need to actually go into them and set their names. So we're going to name these buttons hello, question, goodbye, and toggle. Now we need another button graph that will reflect these buttons here, and we're going to delete our old button graph object and put the new one in the room. Now we want to rename our 4 buttons to hello, question, goodbye, and toggle, the names that we gave them in the room. And then we want hello to go down to goodbye, question to go down to toggle, and then hello to go right to question, and goodbye to go right to toggle. And all of these connections will be 2 ways, so that essentially the 4 buttons will be connected in a grid, and they can move back and forth between them. Now, to connect these buttons is actually incredibly simple if you just want it to work in sort of a debug state. All you need is a simple keyboard check pressed event. We'll use keyboard check pressed VK space, and then you loop through all the buttons using the button parent, and you check to see if their name is equal to the position of the button graph parent, and if so, you simply call their interact. This essentially means that pushing space will have the exact same effect as clicking on a selected button if that button's name equals the position in the button graph. So let's actually run this and see if it works. Just a quick note, because I got an error when I ran it the first time, I forgot to set the initial position in the room editor for our real button graph. It was still set to default, and that causes a crash. So now we're in, and you can see down in the output window that we can move around. So we're on goodbye. That button's inactive, doesn't work. Go over to toggle. We can toggle it on and off. Up to question, over to hello world. Everything works. So everything is connected right now, but obviously this is not super useful. If you don't have this output window down here, which of course you wouldn't in a final product, you won't actually know what button you're on or what is going to happen when you push spacebar. It also doesn't interact very nicely with the mouse. So the next thing we're going to do is fix this problem. Now, one thing I want to point out before I start is that there's actually a bunch of different ways to solve this problem. I went through 3 or 4 before I found one that I thought was simple and easy enough to do. But if you want to get the most out of this tutorial, I would actually stop right now and, if not, try it yourself inside of GameMaker. Maybe sit down with a piece of paper and think about how you would do it. Because again, there's a lot of different ways to handle this particular problem. The first thing that we're going to do is we're no longer going to check to see whether or not a button is selected inside of the button itself. This made sense when we only had one way to select a button, and that is with the mouse. But now that we have 2 ways to select a button, we want to consolidate that idea into a single thing. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the check, and then we're going to make previous selected an instance variable and get rid of the local variable. And the reason for this is we still want to update whether or not the button is selected inside of the button itself. But we're now going to change whether or not it is selected inside of either the mouse manager or the button graph. So we still want the previous selected does not equal selected check, but since we're now changing it outside of this step event, and we don't really know when that change will occur, we need to update previous selected at the end so that when we loop back to the beginning of this step event next time around, we can see if it's been changed in the meantime. And of course, we then need to initialize previously selected in the create event. So now let's go write our update button function. I'm going to put it inside the mouse manager script. So we have function update buttons, and we'll take a string, which will be name, and then we'll simply loop through all the buttons. And if the button's name saved in the variable myname equals the name that we pass in, then selected will be true. And if this is false, selected will be false. Now we just have to use this function. The first place we want to put this function is inside the traverse function of our button graph. Now, instead of doing show debug message, we'll simply update the button's position. Updating it for the mouse is a little bit more complicated. The first thing we have to do is we actually have to check if the mouse is active. If the mouse isn't moving, we don't want the mouse, or we don't want where the mouse is, to override the keyboard. So we only want the mouse manager to work if the mouse is moving around. We can do that with a simple check to see if mouse X is equal to the previous mouse X and then mouse Y is equal to the previous mouse Y. GameMaker doesn't track these inherently, so they're variables we need to add. We can just come down here and do the same type of update we were doing for selected in the buttons. And then we simply want to come over and initialize these variables in the mouse manager. The next thing we want to do is we want to see if there is a change or what the mouse is over. We don't want to update whether or not a button is selected if the button was already selected by the mouse. We can do that like we've been doing by saving the current state of button ID to a temporary variable and then updating button ID. Now we want to check if there's been a change. We also want to check to see if button ID equals no one. If the mouse is not over a button, we don't actually want to update whether or not the button is selected. Now that we have the ability to interact with the buttons with the keyboard, if we simply deselect the buttons, or if we deselect a button because our mouse isn't over it, we're going to have a weird state where no button is selected, and then what will happen if you push spacebar with the keyboard. Now, maybe you want that to be the case, but if you want that to be the case, then you would have to build in some additional checks in your button graph. This will be more clear when we actually test this in a moment. Next, we want to do two different things. First, of course, we want to call the update buttons function, but remember that this function takes a string. Button ID is going to be an instance ID. So here we want to use the dot notation, and we can do that safely because we've already checked to make sure that the button ID is an actual ID and is not no one. And we use this dot notation, button ID dot myname, to pass in the string that is the button's name. The other thing we want to do is update the button graph based upon what the mouse is over. You don't need to do this, but it would be a little bit weird if you didn't, and might be confusing to a user, because then what would happen is if you were moving the mouse around, you could select one button, but the button pointed to by your button graph would be a different button. This ensures that whenever the mouse selects a button, it updates the button graph. The very last thing we need to do is set what happens if the mouse is not active. We can do that with a simple else statement where we set button ID to no one. All right, that should be it. Let's run it and see if everything works. Okay, so we can still move around with the keyboard. We can move around with the mouse. And you can see that when we move the mouse, but then move the keyboard, everything is updating exactly like we expect it to. And of course, the buttons still work. So there's still one last thing we need to fix. That is, we need to handle the very first time we enter the room, because right now all buttons start unselected, but if we push spacebar, we would actually interact with a button. There's a couple different ways to fix this. I'm going to show you my solution. It maybe is a little bit hacky. If you come up with a better one, feel free to leave a comment down below. So the way I'm going to solve this is by simply putting an alarm in the button graph parent for one step, then going to that alarm, and in that alarm, just saying with button parent. So we loop through all the buttons. We see if this is the selected button. If so, we're simply going to manually select it right here. To do that, we can simply come over to the button, copy the code that we want, and set both selected and previously selected. This way the button will be selected, but if we just said button equals selected, or if we just called update buttons, for example here, what would happen is this would all run and the button select sound would play right when you start. Maybe that's okay, but I think that feels a little bit weird. You don't want a button sound to play right when you start a game. So this way we are selecting the button, setting all those variables, but not actually calling the sound. So let's run this one more time. And you can see that we have started with the button already selected. All right, and that is all of the code. I do have 2 more tutorials in this series. One is going to be on making local packages, and one is going to be a review on some of the design. But I think that about wraps it up for what I wanted to cover with making buttons. I hope this has been helpful, and thank you all for watching.